Welcome to part 3 of my guide to video game history. In the previous episode we saw home personal computers being born and the first home console to be successfully released, the Atari VCS. The year is now 1978 and Atari VCS is steadily selling with such classics as the Indy 500, an overhead racer, Tank Plus and Video Olympics. They had also released Concentration, Maze, and the excellent Adventure, which was inspired by the colossal Cave Adventure, or Adventure for short, which was the world's first text adventure. This was the world's first graphical arcade adventure, in the same mould that Zelda would so successfully follow years later. But also it's the first game to have an Easter egg in it. That is to say, a hidden part of the game for players to find out. OK, it only had the initials of the person who wrote the game, that's Warren Robinett, but it still was a first. The reason Warren had done the Easter egg was because he was becoming frustrated at Atari's policy of no individual credit on a game, even for the people who invented it. Therefore, this was his way of sticking two fingers up at Atari by still putting his name on his masterpiece, somehow. In 1978, this was also the year that brought the world its first massively multiplayer RPG. It was called MUD, standing for Multi-User Dungeon, and was invented by Roy Trubshaw, who was a student at Essex University in the UK. He wrote it for the DEC PDP-10 machine, and he named it in tribute to the dungeon variant of Zork that he loved to play. On this year, Sinclair came onto the scene with its Sinclair MK14. Little more than a programmable calculator, its cheap price point meant that 500,000 machines were sold, setting up Sinclair as a major company. Also, in 78, the Interton VC4000 was released. In the arcades, there was a series of classics doing the rounds. There was Clowns, a fun game involving a seesaw and two clowns trying to burst all the balloons. And also Atari Football, the first American football game released for a video game. Atari was ahead of the game. But that was all about to change because in 1978 from Japan, a game invaded the world, taking everybody by storm. So much so that in America they actually ran out of quarters. That game was called Space Invaders. Invented by Tomohiro Nishikado, he had already created some mechanical arcade games such as Skyfighter and Borderline for Taito. But he wanted to go into video games. The initial concept came from the game Breakout, which was huge in Japan at the time in 1976, and it inspired him to go into video gaming himself. Not wanting to do a clone though, he decided to turn the ball into a bullet and the bat into a ship, as he felt that the destroying of blocks was the fun bit of Breakout. In development of the game, he originally had humans as the blocks to be destroyed, but his boss felt that shooting humans would be wrong. So, Nishikado thought to replace them with monsters instead, determining them space monsters when he'd heard of the success of a certain film that had been huge in 1977, called Star Wars. Not seeing the film, however, he instead based the game on space monsters in those that were in H.G. Wells' The War of the Worlds. The game became hugely popular, causing a flurry of addictiveness not seen since Pong. What was worse, Atari's rival, Midway, had got there first with the licensing deal, and was happily rolling it out to arcades across the world. In the best spirit of if you can't beat them, join them, Atari arranged for their own license to release it on their home console, the VCS. And very nice it was too, offering a couple of variants to the game and playing like its arcade parent. even if it didn't quite look like it. Naturally, in 1979, arcades suddenly filled with space-themed games, as they all tried to grab a piece of the action. Notable games was Namco's Galaxian, which took Space Invaders concept further by having attack waves. Also this year in the arcades, Atari made a technical breakthrough with Lunar Lander. The game wasn't a massive success, being a little too sedate for your usual arcade game. It involved you having to land a lunar craft on the moon. Historically though, this game is notable as it's the first game to use vector graphics in the arcade. Atari took what they'd learned from Lunar Lander and used the vector graphics again. In 1979 they released the huge hit Asteroids, taking elements from computer space but having the craft having to destroy all the asteroids in the playing field. This was great fun to play and made it a huge success with the public. Other games of note released in 1979 was Head On, an overhead dodgems game, Atari Baseball, video's first baseball game, Sheriff, one of the first games released by Nintendo in the arcade. Around this time there was a flurry of activity in the home computer market, with everybody wanting a slice of Apple's pie. First machine, the Tandy TRS-80, was actually released at the end of 1977. A little more successful in Europe in 1978 was the Philips G7000, which was a rebrand of the Magnavox Odyssey 2. But the real contender to Apple came at the end of 1979 by Atari themselves, the Atari 800. The machine had a keyboard, but also took cartridges under a cunningly hid flap. It would be this machine that would inspire so many home programmers of the time, and it had some truly excellent games released on it, such as Doug Neubauer's 3D Space Odyssey called Star Raider, the strategy game Archon, released in 1983, and also Mule, released around this time by Dan Buntons. Atari also released the Atari 400. This was intended to be an introduction PC, being cheaper, with only 8K of RAM and with a membrane keyboard. In late 1978, all was not well in Atari. There was a mutiny going on. You see, the people writing the games for Atari and making all this money for them was sick of not getting any recognition, both openly to the public and financially. Things were made worse when marketing in Atari sent out a memo detailing the money made on each of the games sold. Marketing had intended the memo to show what sort of games they should continue to make moving forwards. But for 4 game developers at Atari, it showed them that they were responsible for 60% of Atari's entire sales, and at only earning 30k per person each year, they had made Atari $60 million on that year alone. Those 4 guys was Alan Miller, David Crane, Larry Kaplan and Bob Whitewall, who had made such classics as Canyon Bomber, Air Sea Battle for Atari. After initial attempts to talk to high management in Atari about getting recognition and getting bonuses related to their game successes, they were told that they were no more important than the guy who boxes up the games for shipment, and that they were prima donnas. In mock retaliation, various Atari game designers started to wear an Atari t-shirt saying, "I am a Atari prima donna." So, in June 1979, the cream of Atari's game designers met Jim Levy, a record industry executive who'd already formulated a plan for a third-party video game publisher, and he just needed good game designers to make it happen. On the 1st of October 1979, a new company was formed called Activision, a name by Jim to ensure that the name appeared before Atari on alphabetical listings. The world's first third-party developer and publisher was born, and would go on to make some of the best games on the Atari VCS, such as Pitfall, Kaboom, River Raider, and also Freeway. Well, thanks for listening to part 3 of the video game history. So, with the 70s drawing to an end and the 80s just around the corner, what would the 80s bring to video gaming? Well, to begin with, it would be its next big breakthrough. He's yellow, he's round, and he likes to eat a lot. So until next time, guys, see you later in part 4.